Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are right at this moment, and a warm welcome to our international audience. My name is Dale Willman. I'm with the Earth Institute of Columbia University, which is an international leader in the earth sciences used to move the planet forward toward a more sustainable future. I'm grateful to be joining all of you watching from around the world during the special celebration of the launch of the United Nations Decade on Ecosystems Restoration. As you all know, the world is facing a crisis of a level never seen before by humans. Climate change is altering how and where we live. Biodiversity loss is removing tens of thousands of species from the earth, millions of hectares of land. At times, entire ecosystems have been or are being destroyed. Yet there is something that can be done which can begin to reverse many of these effects if we move quickly. Restoration of both land and water ecosystems is a process that can perhaps on a major scale help to revive the natural world that supports every one of us. Restoration is the process of assisting in the recovery of a degraded ecosystem, and the possible benefits are many. Soil health is restored, supporting healthier food. Renewed treescapes can alter climates, help to refill aquifers, and cool the land. Healthy mangroves on the shoreline restore nurseries for fish many people depend on for survival. And these projects are already happening. Today, we're going to talk about restoration, what it is, how it's implemented. We'll talk about failures because we often learn the most when we don't quite succeed, and we'll celebrate its successes. We'll take you to projects and we'll talk with some of the leading experts in the world of restoration. But first, a brief video about the United Nations Decade on Restoration. And as you can see from that brief video, there are many things that we have to discuss during this program. So my thanks to you for being with us on this journey. We'll first have a discussion in several parts. We'll end with time for at least some of your questions. So whatever platform you're watching on, you can put your comments there, and we'll look for questions toward the end of this program. We have many people joining us, and I'll introduce them as they appear. So first, I'm joined by Judy Schwartz, author of Reindeer Chronicles from Chelsea Green Publishing. Judy has written extensively about soil and restoration. Judy, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So Judy, let's get a quick working definition for restoration, if we could.
Bringing back ecological function. So it's important to understand that natural systems are dynamic. They're always in the process of moving towards greater or lesser function. So ecological restoration is really the task that we have before us is really transformative on many levels. And one is that we're going to be working with nature rather than trying to control her, because nature always strives towards healing, towards greater function and productivity.
And strives toward balance and some level of balance.
Balance is a funny, yeah, you could say balance. It's always dynamic. Like there's no kind of balance that's just kind of, static.
Of course, of course. So what are the size of these projects? What are we talking? What's the scale of what we're talking about here?
Well, the beauty of ecological restoration is that it can start anywhere. No project is too ambitious and no effort is too small. So, the kind of the big one, the largest ecological restoration project that we know of is the restoration of the Loess Plateau in China, where an area of land the size of Belgium was returned to ecological function. And in the process, at least 2 million people have been brought back from poverty.
So this is a tougher question, but do you have any idea of how much land around the world is considered to be in a degraded state?
Wow. Well, we can say that like there's very little land that can be considered completely wild, completely intact. And then even the notion of intactness is in question because we're finding out that areas of the world that we consider wild have in fact been actively managed by people over time. So I've seen anything from 25% to 75% of landscapes are degraded, meaning that they're not functioning, they're not producing, they're not providing the climate regulation capacity that we depend on and that healthy ecosystems afford us.
So it depends on, of course, on the definition, how we define what functional and or what properly functional land is. So what are the major goals then? What are the major goals of restoration?
Well, okay, so I mentioned the Loess Plateau. So there's a fellow named John D. Liu who has documented the restoration of the Loess Plateau as a filmmaker and many other projects. And the way he defines building ecological function, there's kind of a recipe, which is increasing biodiversity, increasing biomass, and increasing soil organic matter. So wherever you are, if you can help promote those three trends, you are, in fact, doing ecological restoration. And of course they interact because as you build more soil organic matter, you are getting more biodiversity because biodiversity actually begins in the soil. So they all work together. But that's the way that I think about it because it kind of grounds it in ecological processes.
And there's a complexity to it. So when people think, I can at least say here in the States, when we think about restoration, we think about efforts to plant 100,000 trees someplace. Is that restoration?
Not necessarily. I know that there's a lot of focus on whether planting trees is a benefit for climate and the environment in general. And I would say it depends. That you need to, in terms of trees, you need to plant the right trees for the right reasons in the right way. And also, we're coming to understand, well, what we might have understood had we really looked at how nature works and used that as our guide, that forests and communities of trees are communities, that they're not just sticks of carbon, and that we need to have a mix, that monocultures of any type are not promoting ecological restoration. For one, they're too fragile. And also, then we're losing the multiple benefits of the processes of how those plants interact each other, how the overstory trees are shading the understory trees, and just how complex these systems are.
And this is, I guess, part of the issue when we're talking about restoration, and we're going to move to grasslands in just a second here, but the idea of complexity. And as human beings, we tend, from a survival perspective, to bring things down to a more simple level, and it's harder to grasp sometimes the complexity. But when we're talking about the return of ecosystem function, we're talking about a very complex layer, a spider web of events, causalities, and things that makes this landscape to be healthier, right?
Absolutely. And the advantage that we have is that nature has been working out these processes for nearly 4 billion years. So for us to step back, to learn from nature as opposed to imposing our will on nature will help us work with nature to rebuild our ecosystems and allow nature and humanity to flourish, as well as our relationship to nature to flourish.
Great, Judy, thank you. You'll be joining us toward the end of the program again, but thank you for being with us. Let's bring our other guests, our next group of guests in with us, and I'm excited to have them all with us. So good morning from my perspective to all of you. Joining us are three people. We've got Phyllis Van Umberg. Yesterday, she and I discovered we're almost neighbors in upstate New York. Phyllis and her family are farmers, teachers, and mentors within the realm of regenerative production. Also with us is Michael Mangano. He's the chief of party in Ethiopia for Project Concern International, PCI, an international non-governmental agency that works with vulnerable communities to improve health. And with us as well is Durakan Dudu. He's a farmer in Turkey, although he's joining us from Sweden right now. And he focuses on regenerative agriculture. He's also an international sustainable rangeland consultant. So Durakan, if we can start with you. When we talk about grasslands restoration, do we mean farms or do we mean much more?
Well, much more for sure. When we talk about grasslands, in some countries, in some contexts, it's usually farms, meaning privately owned land bases, and they can be small, relatively small, uh, down to a few dozens of hectares, or quite huge, as we see in North America and South America and also Australia, with tens of thousands of hectares. But then a big portion of the world has commons, as we call them. Especially you see them in Asia as well as in Africa. And in these places, land is not owned by anyone. Land is managed by the community, local pastoralists most of the time, for thousands of years. And this is how this is how we know that regenerative agriculture and restoring grasslands, it's really not only about a number of techniques to be implemented on the land, but really requires a paradigm shift on how us as humans have to work together.
What does it take to begin to reach that? How do you in order to begin this process, you have to see the need. How do you begin to show people, especially if we're talking about farmland? The Green Revolution of the 60s and 70s drastically changed the way the world approaches farms, from a more holistic approach to a monocultural approach with one crop maximized for its benefit. And we have generations now who have grown up with that view of what agriculture is about. How do you begin to get them to step back and see this broader vision before you can begin to implement it?
Well, yeah, that's a, as they say, $1 million question. That's a big question, and that's a hard question. But I will say it really takes, we as people who want to start who wants to have a social change, kick off a process. I believe one of the point we have to have is humility. We have to be humble, because most of the time experts at least are considered by people as scholars who don't know the reality, who have their own agenda, and who do not really sympathize with the people who are benefiting from that land, who are managing that land. I'm not saying this is the case. I'm just saying this is the perception most of the time. So we have to start with humility, and we have to start with really seeing people as real stakeholders instead of like calling them as beneficiaries or stakeholders. Because everyone, every village, every family, every household, every person has their own what we call holistic context, right? And we have to act accordingly. So coming up with big ideas or big projects that try to standardize that doesn't work. We really have to come up with, and that's what we try to do in Anatolian grasslands, with flexible yet clear structures where different people can be involved in different stages. So, for instance, what we do is that we say, well, okay, this land can be much more productive, right? And at the same time can yield you much more added value. And for this, we have this initiative that we call Safi Mera in Turkey, Turkey's first grass-finished and regenerative animal-based products, meat and so on, brand coming up from our hub. So would you like to be involved? But there is a risk. So, treating people really where they are at that moment in their journey personally, what they have, what they aim, what is their land access, what is their situation with the family. I think this is really, really important. We are usually trying to come up with a solution that will fix a project that will fix this many of hectare, but instead we should come up with models and involvement schemes where people can get in from different entry points.
I mean, it's interesting. What I'm hearing is we're talking about the complex nature of restoration and of ecosystems. And what you're describing, in a sense, is a complex system of recognizing not one size fits all, but you have to have many different elements working in different ways to come together to make this kind of a process happen.
That's for sure. Nature, we say it's complex, and it's very complex indeed. It's a complex system, but basically it's a macro loop or a macro cycle of photosynthesis and decay, or life and death, and then you got infinite number of micro loops within that. But when it comes to society, it's much more complex than nature, how the ecosystems work. So when we talk with people, we say, like working with nature, as long as you got the right perception and a bit of like understanding, that's easy. You learn it. And nature is okay with failures. You learn by failing, you manage better. You don't try to manage perfectly. You try to manage better. But when it comes to human, it's very complex. And we really treat that complexity accordingly. I think that has been what is missing so far. For instance, I am defined by United Nations, FAO, and some other institutions as an expert, as an international expert. And I personally defy that word. I say I'm not an expert. I I will do my best to not become an expert. Not because experts are bad or something, but we really need to have a holistic management and holistic approach to these things instead of like coming up with standardized and very focused, very narrow pieces of information that contradicts each other and so on. So what I will say, we are getting into age of regeneration. That's how I personally define that. And that age of regeneration requires not involvement of only experts or people are concerned, but of the whole society. So we need to come up with new generations who have this ability of seeing the complexity, appreciating it, trying to work with it, and approaching it, coming up with models, ideas, local, regional, national, global, that respect that complexity rather than relying on technical information and hoping that will somehow fix us. Because on technical information, the humanity is not short. That's very clear. That has been the management part. How we do tackle that complexity. That's where we have been failing, and that's what we need to change if we want to have any hope to get into a new age of regeneration. As I say, I see this whole situation as a big opportunity. It's not only trying to solve a problem. Oh yeah, nature is bad, we have to fix it. No, that's not the way I look at it. Actually, we got a super nice opportunity to create something that was much better than before, and that's where we are.
Durkan, I'm going to turn to Michael now, but I want to thank you for being outside and letting us see that. The trees behind don't look necessarily like more like a well-managed forest than a natural forest, but indicators of resilience and of restoration. I'm hearing very faintly in the background a number of birds, and so it's great to hear that this time of day. So thank you. So Michael, let's turn to you. You're working with particularly degraded landscapes in Ethiopia. It's a country that's facing drought, and its shifting global weather patterns could make these conditions the norm for the region. And the country is also dealing with the rebel insurgents in the north. When people are facing potential starvation, a lack of clean water, and potential death, and particularly for young girls and women, why should restoration even be a consideration? And I'll say you're muted too, if you could unmute yourself.
Thanks. I should be sharing my screen now too, I think, but I hope. No, why should it be a priority? Well, we have to start somewhere. This is a socio-ecological cycle, and we need to start somewhere. So social issues are related to ecological issues, and we have to start somewhere. And I think what I'm about to show you will convince you that we need to start in the soil of the pastures in our grasslands.
I'm not sure you can share your screen though. I think that may be difficult.
So you can't see my screen?
We cannot. No, I'm sorry. Let's see. Okay. Nope. Let me do this. Nope, that's not doing it. Sorry.
Yeah, it's quite a visual presentation, but I'll try to put it into words. Essentially, when we look at the grasslands on the planet, there's anywhere between 30 and 60 million square kilometers of the land on the planet that is considered to be rangeland, which is grasslands, tundra, deserts. That's about 20 to 40%. Some people say more of the Earth's land surface. And I'm coming to you from Ethiopia, where Dorican mentioned there's a lot of communal land management. So we have in Africa, 48%. Africa represents 48% of the world's rangelands. And these rangelands hold a huge opportunity to sink carbon if managed well. Right now, Africa itself is 43% grassland and 28% desert. But there's a clear strip starting from the Sahel, going down where I am in Ethiopia, down to the southern part of Botswana, where you have this front line of desertification, where the desert is pushing in on grasslands and towards forests. So the 28% desert is encroaching into that 43%, which is grasslands. And the grass that grows on these lands is very deep rooted. It's evolved over millennia with migrating packs of herbivores. It's very drought tolerant, and it has these beautifully evolved deep roots that hold carbon and water, which are so critical to our systems. So there's the way those evolved were naturally. An herbivore eats grass that gets processed biologically in their system, and it returns to the soil where they trample it. And the way herbivores move is in a pack, trampling, moving. They're usually, the bigger the herd, the safer the individual. So you have what we call a herd effect when you have big herds compared to a single domesticated livestock who might be standing by itself. When you have a lot of animals together, as these grasslands in Africa evolved, the grasslands around the world evolved like this, with migrating packs of herbivores. And when we replace them with domesticated livestock, there's a much different pattern of grazing. So you'll have less hooving impact because you have less competition over forage, and you'll have an animal going back to its favorite grasses again and again until the root system actually shrinks, and eventually that species will die off in that area because it's a favorite of the animals. And then you end up with less desirable, less palatable, less healthy forage. So over time, basically this happens on a large scale where we replace wildlife with domesticated livestock. Over time, as those root systems become deteriorated, you have carbon and water that was stored in the ground that eventually just slowly goes into the atmosphere. So then we have too much carbon in the atmosphere, too much water in the atmosphere, because carbon and water move together. And then we end up with this situation where we're in now. We have erratic, unpredictable rainfalls, of course, global warming, too much carbon in the atmosphere. Carbon is life, water is life. But we need that down in the what we call the biosphere, right, where the layer of the earth where there's actually life. We need the carbon there. We don't need it in the atmosphere to the extent that it is now. So at a large scale, over centuries, transitioning from wild herbivores to domesticated livestock has caused this great deterioration of Africa's grasslands and is leading to desertification. And the knock-on effects of this are, as Dale was mentioning, are astronomical. You have it leads to drought, it leads to floods. We don't have the ground cover that we had before that would suck in rain when it does fall, what we call effective rainfall, but instead we have runoff. So it's actually washing away the soil on the surface of the earth. So this cycle has gotten worse and worse and worse. It leads to irregular migration, displacement, food insecurity, starvation. When people move from one place to another because of either drought or flood, they can find themselves in situations where they have to engage in conflict or other, the social tensions at minimum, and it can lead to long-term displacement as well. So there's a new term there's all these nexuses you hear about, or nexi. You hear about nexus. The land. There's a new one, relatively new one I've heard, called the land degradation migration nexus, which is crucial. A crucial element of what's happening in Africa and beyond Africa is that you have land that becomes unsuitable for use. People start migrating, and the number of natural disasters, droughts, floods has been increasing over the past decades. And it's cyclical. So you have a drought. When you have a drought, the vegetation suffers. And then you have kind of human impact and ecological impact. When there's no vegetation, there's no food. Then you migrate. Then you leave your land behind unmanaged. So with unmanaged land, the desertification gets worse. On the ecological side, bare soils are more susceptible to flood, more susceptible to erosion, which again makes the desertification get worse. And then the drought gets worse, and so on. So it's this cycle, this socio-ecological cycle that's just that needs to stop, and the soils are a place where we can stop it.
Michael, thank you. I'm going to move over to Phyllis now. We're running short in time, and I want to move over to Phyllis, but I want to emphasize that point. I started this by asking you why we should focus on restoration in an area where there is so much other issues going on. But as you're saying, the link to make there is that many of these conflicts, many of these difficulties are created by these ecological problems. The CIA has said for years that some of the most major wars in the future are going to come about because of the problem with water. So access to water, for instance, is going to be a major tensor for war. So if we can get the restoration correct, we can help resolve some of those issues too. So Phyllis, I'd like to come to you now and talk a little bit about what you're doing. You live in a land where monocropping has led to massive soil loss in some areas and degradation, and your work is drastically different. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, I'd love to. So for me, I did visit actually Southern Africa and eerily saw what might happen any place around the world. And as you can see, I live in a region of the world. I live in the Northeast United States, and lots of rainfall, regular rainfall, but becoming less so. And having visited and worked with people in so many different places, it hit me right in the, where it hurts when I thought that no place on earth is not at risk. And we are experiencing more and more monoculture for commodity agriculture. And, we see the degradation in the Corn Belt and in the Midwest of the United States. It shouldn't be a surprise to anyone to know that there is mass runoff, mass soil loss, organic matter loss. And a couple of years ago, there was sort of word on the street that, New York and the Northeast might be the next Corn Belt. And I thought to myself, why on earth would we want to do that when we see what happens? Agriculture always talks about soil health when we're throwing around this term of soil health. And you can talk to any farmer, row crop producer, and they will say we're all about soil health, but there's a distinction sort of, and I don't know if it's really a shop term or not, but soil health means something very different in our recent age of chemical agriculture. Albrecht was, like so many people, a little bit misunderstood and brought us to this idea that all we need to do is add the right mix of stuff, and we can make a lot of things grow, and we can make beautiful things grow that way, but not the way a diverse microbiology in the soil. So in regenerative agriculture, soil health really speaks to the biological health of the soil. And so I've sent in some photographs of the different creatures and things that my kids have found around our farm. So
I've been showing those while you're talking.
Yeah, thank you. My husband Paul and I, we farm with our 5 children, Grace, Vincent, Maggie, Oliver, and Ruby. And we're dairy farmers, which is, I guess we sort of picked the biggest bear to wrestle. I think dairy farming has the biggest rap for being the nemesis of ecological health. And we are doing things differently. We graze the cows all throughout the grazing season, and we feed them on perennial forages throughout the winter. So we have land that is in continuous grass. These forages regrow year after year, and they're grazed methodically by the cattle throughout the grazing season. And this promotes, there's Ashley. We milk over 200 cows, which is not a big farm, but in a grass-fed context, it's quite a big farm. We're really pushing the limits of using perennial systems to produce commodity milk. And that's sort of our inlet in pushing the limits of what we can do with restoration. Does it have to be rangeland? Does it have to be a small permaculture? What about in dairy farming? Can we have restoration in dairy farming? And so far the answer is yes. And we see, the bird sounds that you heard in the back of, when Dudu was speaking. When we go out to move the cows, we hear birds. There's birds, insects, wildlife. We don't want to take out the hedgerows. We want to leave those intact. We want all of that to sort of feed this healthy ecological system. And I think probably, how can we make it happen? We have to go do it. We have to do it and let people see that it's possible, and talk about the overarching basic ecological functions that make things turn. And those are universal. It doesn't matter where you are. We talk about there's certain subtle differences when rainfall seasonality changes, but we all need to promote that water cycle. We need to promote the cycling of minerals and carbon compounds. We need to capture the sun's energy, and we need to promote diversity, because working together is the only thing that's really going to save us. So diversity across the board. We need to combat monoculture and bring diversity back in, and we need to prove that it can be done across the board of agriculture, because I'm statistically insignificant. Farmers have been dropped from the U.S. Census because we are no longer, there's not enough of us, but we need to all change the way we think about food and food production in order to make it happen.
That's a powerful statement about being dropped from the census. Wow. Look, I wish we had more time for each of these segments, and I'm grateful for all of you spending this time with us, but we're going to move on to soil, which is what we've been talking about here as well. I mean, this is a very significant element that we've been discussing. So thank you for your time. Phyllis, I'll be down to see you at some time this summer, and I appreciate you all joining us. So I'm going to add in Nicole, and I'm going to move the rest of you out here if I could. And Nicole, I'm looking for Ratan to join us as well, and I'm not sure. I've got a J and an Ali here, so I'm not sure if either of those. But Ratan, if you're listening, if you would put on your camera so I can see you. And in the meantime, I will introduce Nicole. Nicole Masters is an agroecologist and educator. Trained in ecology and soil science, she works with producers to increase environmental outcomes on their land while also increasing profitability. And I will also mention Ratan Lal, who is a soil scientist at my alma mater, the Ohio State University. He's also considered by many to be the father of the science behind soil regeneration. So, Nicole, while we wait to see if Ratan is joining, let me start with you. And can you tell us what is a gauge of good soil health? How do we know when soil is strong and healthy?
It's such a good question, and it's so context specific. But really, if we look around the world, is this soil reaching its full potential in terms of it's that water holding capacity, is that production, is that food quality, and is that resilience and resistance to things like insects and diseases and fluctuating temperatures. So it's really that outcomes based. We can look at visual things and say, hey, I want to see, I call these the Rastafarian roots. I want to see these root structures that the roots are totally covered by soil material, and that's going to help protect it. Or I want to see aggregate stability. So that means when we have a very strong wind, those soils hold together, or we have strong rainfall, that those soils behave like a sponge and they're not going to wash away. So it's all of these sort of structural components that give us resilience. Do we see biodiversity in terms of microbiology, and are they active? There's so many different measures, and this is the exciting part, I guess, in working with soil right now, is it really is the new frontier in pulling back these layers and trying to understand how do we measure a healthy soil, but also what does that mean in terms of for all of us across society.
It seems that my camera has disappeared once again. I have issues with this periodically. I'll try and get that going. But in the meantime, you can still hear me, I think. Good. Okay. So I want to talk for a moment about community-supported agriculture, CSAs, and the reason is that was my introduction, in a sense, to soil chemistry and soil biology. And we had young farmers here, Michael Kilpatrick and the rest of the kids in his family, who ran the first CSA I ever belonged in. And he talked about the degraded soil of the land that he had and how he was introducing microbes into the land, into the soil microbes to bring it back. And you touched on that. What is the significance of it? What does that mean? And why should we be looking at that?
It's so interesting. You started in CSAs. I started in community gardens. And it's not so much the need to reintroduce microbiology, but the switching on of the metabolites or the signals that microbiology provides. So those signals are provided by plants. Those signals can be provided by our management or our mismanagement. So there's a variety of signals. Like if you think on the outside of a cell wall, there's 100,000 receptors, and those receptors are waiting for some kind of signal. And wherever that signal comes from determines what is the gene expression, how is it that a microbe can actually switch on and become virulent and become a pathogen, or a microbe could actually become beneficial. So it's not so much the biodiversity, because the microbiology is all around the planet. It's in the atmosphere, it's in the rainfall, it's all around us. It's who is being turned on in this particular situation? What is the microbe that's responding to whatever we're doing? And so that's kind of what I'm getting increasingly excited about. And when you look in the literature, that's what's really blowing up right now. And science is really looking at what are these different types of metabolites, and how it is that microbiology communicate with each other to say, are you my friend? Are you my foe? Am I going to eat you? And actually seeing how organisms can hunt together, almost like a pack of wolves, based on these metabolites, because they don't have eyes, they don't have ears. It's all about signals.
So I want to bring this to your work. And again, Ratan, if you're in the green room, you can hear me, you need to turn on your camera so I can see you, so I can bring you into this conversation. So we're still hoping Ratan will be able to join us. I love the image behind you, by the way, and your puppy that just walked in the background. My cat will wander through at some point if I can get my camera back on. So I want to bring this to the work that you do. And the question about whether there's a conflict here, the idea of increasing soil health while also increasing profitability. Can you talk about that?
It's so fascinating, and I wonder where this myth pervades from. And I think really, if we go back in time, it's an industrial era story. You have to have these chemical inputs or you're not going to be profitable, you're not going to have yield. And that it's kind of what's stuck around. and pervaded through society now for 140 years. And what we find is that is just not true. And actually the opposite is true. And if we continue on this chemical treadmill, this is where we're really going to discover that actually, yes, ecosystem health and soil health are what enables property to be profitable. And I see you've fallen off, Dale, but I can keep going all by myself. So currently, my organization, we work with organizations that support around 59 million acres. And through that process, we're looking at what is this value proposition. And I hate talking about soil in terms of commodities, because I think that's a really dangerous avenue for us to start to head down. But what we find is it's the external costs that are really not making systems profitable. So if you're not looking after soil health, then you're going to have to pay for its services. And Ratan, I think, was going to talk to this, which is, a healthy soil is what's going to help reduce pests, weeds, and diseases. A healthy soil is what holds on to water. A healthy soil is what enables plants to uptake nutrients and vitamins and secondary metabolites and all the things that make for healthy, nutrient-dense foods. But if we undermine that soil health system, you're now going to have to pay for that. So you're now going to have to pay for nitrogen, you're going to pay for phosphorus, you're going to need an insecticide, you're going to need a pesticide, you're going to need a herbicide, and all of those things become externalities, and that includes irrigation water too. You're going to have to pay for water. And we're facing these scarcities, and I hate to say it's a perfect storm, because it's a terrible thing to say, but it is, because we're seeing these increasing pressures in communities. And I was actually running a workshop in a very conventional cropping area. I had 30 cropping guys, and we were talking about who wants to see their kids return to the farm, and no one did. And it was really interesting. And finally, this gentleman stood up and he said, "Our inputs are going up. Our debt is rising. I don't know what's happening with the climate, and I am so stressed. Why would I want to see my kids return to this?" And this is the story that we're seeing across cropping regions around the world. And it doesn't matter what ecosystem we're in, ecosystems are under pressure, and it's costing producers more and more, and it's becoming this razor-thin wire in terms of profitability. So we find if we can close those loops, and we work with around 240,000 acres of cropping. We close those loops, then now it becomes profitable, because every action that you take is, how do we build soil health, how are we building resilience, and how do we have healthy, nutrient-dense crops? And we really see that comes through when we're under environmental pressures, is that those crops will yield more than the conventional crops, and about the same in a year that's a good year, but their costs are significantly less. Sorry, Dale, you dropped out. I kept going without you, though.
Oh, that's fantastic. I don't know if, can you hear me?
I can.
I'm having problems. I'm trying to load up on another computer. My other computer has sort of kicked me out of the whole system. So
How weird.
I'm going to bring Jane in just a minute here. So in fact, I should probably do that now. Nicole, thank you for carrying the show there while I disappeared. And I'm sorry that we don't have more things that we can bring up here, but I'm going to have to turn here because I have to do this from two different ways. So I want to thank you for being a part of that. And let me find Jane here real quick. And I'm going to bring Jane up into this. So hopefully you can hear me. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're echoing, Dale.
My apologies for the problems with all the echoing and everything else here. So I'm trying to work on that. So Jane, let me swing this over here. How do I kill the, let me do this. One last thing. There. That should remove the echo. Sorry about that. My apologies. Jane Madgwick, thank you for your patience for joining us. And Nicole, I'm going to get you out of the stream here. There. All right, thank you. So, Jane, welcome. And thank you for your patience, understanding of the strangeness. Jane is the CEO of Wetlands International, is at heart an ecologist who likes to keep her feet on the ground and in the mud. She now coordinates a global network organization dedicated to the safeguard and restoration of wetlands. Wetlands account for a huge portion of sustenance for people around the world. And this is an important point I want to make sure that we focus on, that they filter water, they provide nurseries for much of the fish and seafood we eat as humans. Jane, what's the current state of wetlands around the world?
Not good, Dale. We've lost around 3/4 of the wetlands that were around 100 years ago. And we're still losing them at a faster rate than other ecosystems. So, in fact, 3 times as fast as forests. And yet the response to that is also, and they're, on a science basis, you really would put them first because it's 40% of biodiversity depends on inland and coastal wetlands. And because they are the key to our water security, as has been mentioned by a few speakers already, then they really are a massive part of the life support system that we need. So, yeah, these are the water systems of the planet.
So talk to me. Can you hear me? Can you hear me okay?
Fine, yeah.
Okay, talk to me if you would about restoration of wetlands and what does that look like? What does that mean?
Well, it depends which kind of wetlands we're talking about. But let's say mangrove systems. Most people can picture what mangroves are like. We've lost, there used to be about 33 million hectares. We've lost about half of that, and about 20% are now very degraded. So restoration of mangroves, actually, what people have been busy doing is planting them, and we've shown that this is this is a natural mangrove system you see here, but planting is very ineffective. 80% of those projects fail, and that's largely because people are trying to plant the wrong kind of species in the wrong place in the wrong time, and the conditions just aren't there. So we promote an ecological approach to mangrove restoration, such as Judy was referring to in the beginning. And basically, if you understand why they were lost, what changes in the natural systems, or what triggered the loss, then you can create the conditions in which mangroves recover. And mostly, then the right complement of different species will find their own way back. And you can support that with some planting. Sometimes that's necessary. Very often it's about restoring the hydrology. Sometimes it's a lack of fresh water even, as river systems dry up. So reconnecting the whole water system, this allows mangroves to find their own way back, and they can recover really quickly. In 3 or 5 years, you really see at least tens of hectares come back, and this tends to then develop of its own course. But for other wetlands like peatlands, for example, I mean, the primary cause of the loss of peatlands is drainage.
So in places like Indonesia and other places where these are being destroyed to put in palm plantations, for instance, is a loss of peatlands.
Southeast Asia has seen a huge loss of peat swamp forests. The home of the orangutan, etc. I mean, and here you've got like 20, 30 meters of depth of peat. And you can't grow crops on this without, like palm oil crops, without drainage. But this is a massive problem, not least because of the huge emissions of carbon dioxide from that. And actually, the palm oil plantations don't do well on peatlands. It's just that this is the land that's being grabbed, essentially. And it's devastating for nature, it's devastating for the people there, it causes floods and droughts, and it's very short term. But it's also, at the other extreme, most of the Arctic is covered by a layer of peat. So it's 80% wetland, and even just laying a pipeline, like an oil gas pipeline, on that peat layer will cause a warming effect, which in turn threatens the thawing of the permafrost underneath. So roads, pipelines, this kind of things, disturbing this insulating peatland layer, even locally can have a really big regional effect and eventually a global effect. So re-wetting of peatlands is what we're busy and doing this on a big scale, like 100,000 hectares at a time in Indonesia, in Russia, places like this.
How do you undertake a project of that scale? How do you undertake a project of 100,000 hectares, which is about 250,000 acres, I think? How do you undertake a project of that massive scale when it's so complex and make it successful?
That's a good question. So essentially, we don't. What we do is we enable others to do that. So in Russia, for example, the fires, they were called forest fires, but they were not. They were peatland fires of some years ago. They really, you know, Moscow was full of smoke, health issues. So it got the attention of political leaders, and they realized, okay, we need to re-wet these peatlands. What we did was connect with we used our own experience, and we connected with others, scientists, particularly in Germany, and we worked with Russian governments and at the different levels to enable them, to give them the knowledge base in which to do the restoration. But you know, the Russian Federation is doing the restoration, is paying for that. That's a large investment, but it's tiny compared with the economic and social losses caused by, you know, these fires. Same in Indonesia. We create the knowledge base. We try restoration techniques on a small scale. We prove them. We do that involving the local community, involving the government, involving the private sector. And actually now the biggest restoration project, which is actually using the voluntary carbon market, is being run by a business set up just for that. And we continue to advise, you know, and make sure that this is done in a real way to bring lasting sustainability. So we play a convening role, is the short answer, Dale. We are trying to enable others to do this work because, you know, otherwise it will never be enough. To scale up, we need to enable public and private sector to really play a strong role and connect them with civil society.
But something we haven't talked about in this program yet is what it takes to actually do this, and on a human scale. So, you know, we're talking about major projects, 100,000 hectares. What about the individuals? What can people do? How can they be involved in this process? What can they do to make this happen effectively?
Yeah, and the most important people in such projects, if you like, are the people living in the landscape or who depend on the landscape. I mean, you know, they need to be engaged right from the beginning, and you know, it's about blending their traditional knowledge or their local knowledge with cutting edge science to really understand, you know, what's going on in this landscape, what has happened to the different systems, and how do the natural changes interact with society and economy. And we find that, you know, by having a very inclusive process to share knowledge, get a common understanding, you're halfway there to identifying some solutions. And then, you know, it takes 10, 20 years to really make a big change. But at least at that point, you can start going in the right direction and action can start. And again, that needs to be in a way that is owned by the local society. So, yeah, and that means even land ownership and recognizing the changes in the planning frameworks, shifting policies to underpin that. That enables finance to come in that can accelerate and extend what's happened. So you start a sort of snowball effect then. And then, of course, success can inspire others. So, you know, communities inspire other communities. They even get competitive about the ideas and ways to go forward. So, yeah, we think, I mean, we see that it's a daunting prospect. The scale of wetland recovery that's actually needed, it is daunting. So we believe the only way to really achieve that in this decade is, you know, this combination of enabling actors, you know, local communities to become change agents and push the change bottom up. At the same time, they don't get very far sometimes unless the political leaders, you know, the Ministry of Finance sees this as a priority. So getting the political leaders on board early and enabling policies, investments to trickle down that has to happen in synchrony.
So we talked about this being restoration being a complex process, and the nature of a healthy system being complex. So it sounds like the process of going through this is also complex, and there are many layers between political process, social pressure, individual action. There are many layers that have to be involved to make a restoration process a success. Is that reasonable?
Yeah, I mean, it can be complex in the sense that you never have certainty. I mean, nature is always really in control, and you have to be ready and adaptive for surprises. But actually, we just launched a report together with some partner organizations today on a framework for landscape restoration. You can get this from Wetlands International's website. It's called a 4 returns framework. And this sets out a process which, basically is simple. 5 key steps in the process. 3 different kinds of zones in the landscape, and a long-term partnership to bring this about. So we've tried to use experience from around the world, tested experience, and make a very practical framework and a common language which will enable, equally indigenous communities, the business sector, farmers, etc. So because it isn't rocket science. I mean, you have to follow nature. You have to take a logical process from vision that's based on understanding through to action and learning. So I don't think people should be afraid of complexity.
All right, so we need to move on to Natalie in just a moment here, but I have the slide of the power of wetlands. Can you explain that very quickly for us?
Yes. So we started a campaign last year, Power of Wetlands, really inspired by young people who see that wetlands and investments in wetlands need to come to the fore. And they shared their stories. And recently they launched a campaign which we're supporting, which is really calling on governments to include wetlands in their climate plans. So if you go to our website, www.wetlands.org, you will quickly find this opportunity to sign an open letter and join this campaign. People are joining from all over the world because wetlands are, the mega stores of carbon. They are the biggest terrestrial stores, not forests, by really a long way. And yet they're not getting recognised and included in the plans at the national level. And if they're not in those plans, the finance isn't going to be there to safeguard those carbon stores and to restore more. So please add your name to this, and this will help.
Great, Jane, thank you, and I appreciate your patience with our with our technical issues here. I'm grateful to have you join us today, so thank you so much. So we're going to move to Natalie Topa. Natalie, I don't know if you can get your camera on or not, but Natalie is the Regional Resilience and Livelihoods Coordinator for East Africa and Yemen for the Danish Refugee Council. So Natalie, thank you for joining us, and I know that your bandwidth is slight there, and we've already had some technical issues, so we won't be troubled if you have to disappear. But I'm going to try and get the slides up in a moment here that you sent to me so we can take a look at those. So give me a second to get those done. But when we think of restoration projects, I think for many, the idea of urban landscape restoration does not come to mind. Why is that?
Well, because we think we're separate from nature. I think that's when we really departed from our own resilience. And, the irony is here, one of the reasons my bandwidth is so bad, I had my iPhone, because my hotel internet here in Entebbe, Uganda is so poor that I set the iPhone out on the balcony, but there's a whole family of monkeys out there that will take my iPhone. And so I think that's a great sort of segue into your question. We are nature, we are water, we are carbon, right? And we think, because of religion and culture and all these different things, that we're separate, we're superior. And so I think coming back into relationship with nature, having a goal of transitioning back into an ecological civilization is what we really need to collectively focus on. We're not separate, and I think think also how we create the built environment, right? We've created these urban spaces that are made out of concrete. Most people don't realize that we consume more concrete than food by metric ton. First water and then concrete and then food. So even the way we construct our built environment, our human, habitats, also has to be in relationship with nature as well. And then that will tie into a lot of circularity and opportunity. So thanks. That's my presentation. I did want to make one correction. My title is Regional Resilience and Livelihoods Coordinator for East Africa and Great Lakes Region. It was previously with Yemen, but we've shifted. So I want to talk about how to bring trees into our built environments and urban landscapes. My master's was urban and regional planning with a focus on economic development. And so much of that is about design and space making. And there's so much opportunity for urban ecology and even food forestry in that. And what are some of the benefits of that? Trees, one thing we have to remember is that we are tree people living on a tree planet, and that's what we need to understand and get back to. So there are so many benefits to trees. They're problem solvers on so many levels. First of all, if we think about climate change and all the issues that we are facing right now, trees can help us, as some of the previous speakers have mentioned, with climate mitigation, sequestering carbon, getting those sugars into the soil to build healthy soils that I know that Nicole Masters was talking about. But in urban spaces, reducing heat island effect. So what that means is that when we have impervious, impermeable hardscapes in an urban environment like sidewalks and buildings that bounce heat off of each other, in the absence of that biomass and that vegetative cover, that heat really intensifies and amplifies. That can have an effect on workers and productivity, on the amount we spend on air conditioning. So, as we try to build more urban ecology into our urban scapes, that can have major financial implications as well. There was a study done in New York about how the presence of trees can reduce AC and have so many benefits, not only on the pollution and removal of, moving away from fossil fuels, but the reduction of costs on interior climate control. I think so, there's a whole movement right now around sponge cities, getting more permeability within our urban scapes. When we have all this hardscape and compacted surfaces, water accumulates, it runs off, it gathers into floodwaters that we then have to spend money and investments and infrastructure to manage. Why do that? When we can park that water, slow the flow, plant the rain, get that same water into production with trees, urban food forestry systems. If you move on to the next slide, it is definitely tied to economic vitality and placemaking, right? Human beings like to be in nice, shaded, cool, beautiful places. We all love our cars, but we love to park our cars, and we like to go and walk around in urban villages and see outdoor cafes. I had an urban design teacher who said that humans are like trout. We like to collect in the eddies and watch the river go by. So from a real estate perspective, that's also really important in terms of placemaking and creating livable, walkable communities that are shaded and healthy. And if we go on to the next, this slide, it is also very tied to human and wildlife well-being. The quality of air, the quality of water, the availability of food. I know that we'll have a talk on social justice and how that links to restoration. Look at in the US where we have ghettos, urban places that are absolute food deserts. People have to go to the convenience store to buy their food supplies. So integrating food security, soil security, water, carbon security into the urban realm, especially when we do have this thinking that's quite linear, that there is urbanization is a given. Well, if that's the case, then let's plan for that and design so that it's a positive, healthy, safe environment. I'm going to show a couple of examples. One from one of the places that I work, which is in Dadaab refugee camp. You can go on to the next slide. I think you're not using the latest presentation that I sent, but that's okay.
Couldn't get access to that.
Okay, no worries. This is so, as I was mentioning about heat island effect, this is in Dadaab in the Somali region of Kenya, which is is a place where we have one of the largest refugee camps in the whole world. And if you just look at this photo, this was within a few meters from each other, where there's totally bare soil. Look at that temperature. That is 55 degrees. Soil is like humans. It needs to be cool so that soil microbiota and life can thrive. And if you have those hot, dry land conditions with no vegetative cover, no tree like on the right hand side, those temperatures, and again, this was just a few meters away from each other. Now imagine being a refugee living in the conditions on the left hand side and not the right hand side. If you go to the next slide, actually, so in Dadaab, where we have our office compound, which is within the larger UNHCR compound, we were experiencing a lot of flooding. And so the name of the game here is really about design. What we started to do when I got there is, because of security, I can't go out and spend significant amounts of time with our teams to show them how to do the technical components of agroecology and agroforestry. So we started within our compound to create a sponge effect, right? To plant that rain. We don't want water moving and accumulating into floods. We want to create a sponge and turn that water from destruction to production and hold that water in place. If you go to the next slide. So, this is how our teams are starting to understand the vegetative cover, mulches, organic materials, biomass, and also other resources in the urban space. Here what we've done is tapped our air conditioners. While I was there, all of our ACs were dripping every day. And I realized, I stuck buckets under the ACs. And in a 24-hour period, we were getting 7.5 liters out of one AC. We have 50 of those. That means 10,000 liters of water in a month in a so-called water scarce environment. Get that water into production, harvest it, harness it, grow trees with it that can, create a much more livable, healthy environment for our staff and as well for the refugees. So again, here we're using the compounds to show our teams what we want to do in the refugee spaces. So if you go to the next slide. So we do have a program. We have multiple programs there, and one of them, we are working at the household level. This is not it. Okay, so because this isn't the correct presentation, I'll just jump around a bit. If you go to the previous slide, the other example that I was going to share was about Fumba Town in Zanzibar. So Fumba Town is it's an intentional community that has a permaculture landscaping team and department led by Franco Gosse and Bernadette Kirsch. And what they're doing is integrating design for ecology and urban food forestry even before the homes are being built. Immediately, it's raising property values. It's creating that livability, that walkability, and those high real estate values, by the way. And this is actually, I was in a course there last week headed by Quinton Christian from Ecodomes Africa. If you go to the next slide, where we were learning how to do super adobe construction. So the benefit of this is we're reducing timber already. That's a climate mitigation measure. We're reducing iron in the construction as well as cement, very, very minimal cement. So this is earth bag construction using only locally available materials. But again, they've created a design and then they filled in so much of this with fruit trees and berries, and it just becomes a food jungle, a magical food jungle for children that eat berries and munch on things all day. It's a wonderful place. It's called Fumba Town in Zanzibar. If you go to the next slide. So yeah, it's, we're creating edible towns. Why would we not do that? Doesn't that sound cool? Shouldn't every town, every city just be edible? So here what they've done is they've designed the streets to just naturally pour, you're not seeing curb and gutter. What you're seeing is that that the crest is on the opposite side of this median, which is a food island. So all that storm water runs off and it just parks and soaks into this beautiful giant jungle of food. And in there you've got food, fodder, fiber, fuel, fertility, pharmaceuticals with an F, all of the Fs that we love in food forestry. So, as you walk down this little road, you've got coconuts, bananas, papayas, chaya tree spinach. It's unbelievable. It is impossible to be food insecure in this place. And the important thing about our food systems that we have to understand is the importance of perennial stability. Farms should never be, harvested and bare and naked. Always you need that perennial stability, which is the life support system of our annual crops. if we go on to the next slide, not even sure what to expect on this next slide because, okay, so in Fumba Town, not only are the roads going into, the road water being harvested into those food islands, but even the houses have what they call a green drain. So roof water is pouring right into these food systems. And when you buy a house in Fumba Town, you get a little menu of the kind of perennial foods that you'd like to have. So what kind of trees do you want? And then the landscaping team comes and assembles everything for you. And all you do is sit and enjoy your life in your house while this abundant organic regenerative food system springs up all around you. And this shows how we can create nature positive solutions within the built environment. So the other thing I wanted to mention about Fumba Town, which is really important, which is also what we're doing in the camps, is circularity, right? Taking waste streams and turning them into value streams, turning trash into cash. And in our urban places, I heard New York City will soon be taking all their organic waste, converting that into rich, healthy compost to be used in not only urban gardening and landscaping, but even for peri-urban agriculture systems. And here in Fumba Town, what Franco and Bernadette have led is a system where all residents have a very, very clear system on how to how they manage their waste. They go throw it outside in sorted bins. All that gets put into a central composting system. So that energy doesn't leave that community. We're reducing entropic loss. When carbon and nutrient come into the community, there's a merry-go-round. There's a nutrient economy that it spins around, and that folds back into food security, shade, beautification, livability, property values. So if we go on to the next slide, you can see even the titles aren't correct here. Sorry about that. But I think it will share the correct presentation. Feel free to share out that next presentation. I think this is the last slide. So those previous slides from Fumba Town were when it was just being built up. Now it's really, you see this biological uplift, and you're just surrounded by food. I mean, it's just, why would not every city have a food parkway, a highway of of food? And so every weekend there are community markets with local regenerative enterprise supporting local artisans and food producers, and there's events, community events, music, it's lively. And so then you start to, the urban ecology creates a framework for the social permaculture where people fraternize those public spaces more. They're shaded, they're cooled. Zanzibar is not a cold place. It's very hot. So if you don't have those shaded spaces, it just becomes very, very difficult to be outside comfortably. And so, you're extending the outdoor living, those outdoor living rooms, just by virtue of space making through trees. And lastly, my point is, the tree systems that we create should reflect and celebrate the local heritage. If I'm in Somalia, if I'm in Yemen, we've got trees with tiny little leaves and sharp, pokey things. But I'm here in Uganda, we've got giant leaves and so verdant and green. And it communicates to me where I am and the identity and the heritage of this space. And that can also lead to beautification, placemaking, real estate values, and economic vitality of even commercial spaces. So I think I'm going to wrap that up here. And thanks a lot for the opportunity.
Natalie, I really appreciate your time. I seem to be having echo here. I'm not quite sure where it's coming from. But Natalie, thank you. And I know how difficult it is where you're coming from to be able to make this happen. So I appreciate your being with us. So we're going to move on to, let me find one quick thing here. We're going to move on to the idea of restoration as an economic justice, as a justice issue. And this is important to me to talk about, because as we talk about the whole concept, oh, my camera's disappeared again. Can you still hear me? Janine, could you nod if you can still hear me? Good, okay. If we talk about restoration, we also have to talk about how it affects the people around it. So I have two guests. Tero Mustonen is a defender of the traditional worldview and cosmology of his people, and is the head of the village of Selki in Finland. He's passionate about his work with Indigenous groups around the world and in his home. Also, Janine Yazzie is a community activist in the western portion of the United States. She's a co-founder and CEO of Sixth World Solutions, which works with Diné communities to promote sustainability, environmental justice, and self-governance. So Janine, let me start with you. Why is environmental restoration an issue of justice?
Hi, thank you, Dale. And thank you to all the previous presenters. Such exciting statements of the commitments that are needed and the work that needs to be done in order to effectively and efficiently carry out large-scale landscape level restoration projects. But justice comes in almost every aspect of how these projects are conceived of, the problems that they're structured to address, and the way forward that we as humanity really need to unite around. One of the biggest things I think needs to be pointed out is that as our world governments sort of come together around different international agreements, I know we're discussing the UN Decade on Restoration, one of our hardest negotiations around the Paris Rulebook has been to get any rights language and included into that document as well, which is supposed to be one of the guiding documents to help our governments uphold those commitments. And we see this across the board. And this is because of what's happening internationally, as well as has been happening domestically, and the corporate capture of a lot of these discussions, which tend to center a version of sustainability that is really about profits and maintaining and control of resources, maintaining the upward flow of wealth and power. And all of that has deep roots in the systems that we're trying to change. And so we cannot try to create reform for more successful and efficient biodiversity restoration projects in systems that are inherently rooted in the exploitation of lands, territories, and peoples, particularly of Indigenous peoples and of our African and Afro-descendant relatives. And so, like many of the presenters said before, we definitely need a holistic and systemic approach, but we also need rights-based approaches. With everything from like energy, land, water, and food, we can break down both what needs to happen, but also what are the root inequalities and rights issues that are at the foundation of the systems we're trying to change. Like with energy, it's not so much just divesting from fossil fuels and transitioning to renewable energy. If we're not going to fix the problem that we have if we don't also look at issues of consumption, at issues of waste that are still inherent in renewable energy development. If we don't look at where these projects are being slated, which are often near and adjacent to vulnerable or systemically oppressed communities or Indigenous peoples' territories. The same with land. We know that the most biodiverse places are often on lands that are stewarded customarily by Indigenous peoples, yet Indigenous peoples only retain 10% of legally recognized rights to those territories. We also know that with water, and I know a lot of the examples were work that's happening in so-called developed nations, but we also need to look at our developed nations to set those models, to be the leaders in these discussions and in implementing these solutions in our own communities. And in the US and other developed nations, there's no recognized human right to water. And that became a huge thing in the pandemic. But with food, in our food systems, Indigenous peoples have been at the forefront trying to push back against the monocultural food production model. A lot of Indigenous peoples are cattle growers in places that are unsustainable because that was part of the assimilation project into an American westernized economy. And so until we can understand these issues, we're going to continue to, I think, misrepresent where the causes of overgrazing, our unsustainable agriculture truly come from and how we need to address them. And we also need to talk about the inherent racism and inequality that exists in our food systems, because anything that is coming up from the recognition of traditional ecological knowledges and practices, the importance of them, the importance of agroecology and those principles that are embedded in them, all of these, unless they're also actively dismantling systemic oppression in our food systems, they're going to continue to fall short in being the solutions that we need. So with the work that we're doing, we try to bring all of this to the forefront and address issues as simple as like ensuring that the 2018 USDA Farm Bill recognizes dryland farming as one of the sustainable practices for agriculture in the desert Southwest. And things like that are hard fought battles that take a long time in order to get even just the marginal parts of our rights recognized as Indigenous peoples. But I think when we recognize that Indigenous rights are human rights and that all of us as humanity deserve rights-based approaches in implementing these solutions that center place-based, eco-smart, regenerative solutions, we won't be able to meet any of our commitments or build the sustainability that is necessary for our communities.
Tara, if you're with us, if you could get your camera on, if that's possible, or there we go. So Tara, you've heard what Janine has to say from the world that you inhabit and the work you do. How does that relate, and how does that fit with what you're doing?
Well, greetings from the boreal village of Selkie in Finland, and let me recognize Janine and all the traditional owners of this virtual seminar. I'm Tero Mustonen, and I work for an organization called Snow Change. A lot of the issues that Janine was highlighting are, of course, of tremendous significance for local, traditional, and indigenous communities all around the world. And justice, equity sits at the very heart of the solutions that we have to take today. I thought I would highlight just 3 points from our work that fit pretty much in the international context to what Janine was talking about in the Navajo and US realities. In fact, you could argue that rewilding and restoration, these kind of things that we're discussing today, are one of the only mechanisms to undo the injustices and the damages and the equity trouble that has taken place over the past centuries of huge colonial damage to the planet, whether it's the oceans or terrestrial ecosystems, wetlands, and so on. I'm sitting in a way in two worlds. I lead a small village that has been recognized by the government of Finland to be culturally heritage national village because of our oral histories, links with the land, the way we do things, and architecture. We are linguistically related to Karelians and Sami, who are the non-Indo-European linguistic groups in this part of the world. So I'm very much leading rewilding and restoration from the village viewpoint. At the same time, I'm sitting currently in the IPCC, which is the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, where that's the elites, that's where the heads of the state and scholars come together to try to find the solutions that we need. And on both realities, rewilding and restoration has risen over the past few years as a major justice and equity process. And as Janine was saying, we know from peer-reviewed science and indigenous knowledge that roughly 80% of world's remaining biodiversity sits on indigenous homelands. So the very simple question is that they must be doing something rather well if that's true, and if most of the remaining intact habitats are still there. My first case that I would like to just talk about very quickly is Australia. Snow Change, my organization, supports an indigenous Australian local nonprofit called Firesticks. All of us know about the tremendously horrifying fires of Australia from last year, where whole millions of hectares were wiped out. Koalas died in numbers that are very hard to think about, as well as all those other animals and humans at a great cost. Now, in the work that we do with Firesticks and their leader, Victor Stephensen, we try to support the return of good fire to the country, as they would say, and bring back the notion that actually indigenous Australians burned the country prior to colonial attacks. In other words, what was then seen by Captain Cook and the very first Europeans was actually well-managed indigenous landscapes, of course not burning everywhere, but using cold burns, seasonal burns, very specific tree ecosystem-based burns to lessen the fuel load, enable better pastures for game animals and plants, and so on and so on. So one of the conversations that's now going on in Australia on restoration and justice is how can we bring back indigenous burns to lessen the fuel load and avoid what happened in 2019 to 2020. If I think of the Arctic and the Boreal, which is kind of our home area, of course, very same kind of issues are coming back to reality here. As we heard from Jane, the North holds 1/3 to 1/2 of world's soil-based carbon. And not many, perhaps in the audience, know about that, but it's actually true that the North contains both the boreal ecosystems, the peatlands, and the high Arctic contain so tremendous amount of carbon that we have to think about ways of keeping that carbon on the ground, and especially on degraded peatlands. Rewilding using justice and restoration as a mechanism led by the communities has become a central solution that has also global significance. Let's also pause just for 1 second to realize that a lot of the northern habitats, including these peatlands, are major bird migration hotspots in terms of we welcome so much of the waders, ducks, and all the other species through the flyways from Africa and the southern areas into the north, and maintain globally relevant biodiversity in the process. And that's why we started in Snow Change about 5 years ago, something called the Landscape Rewilding Program. To date, we have restored and are influencing positively over 28,000 hectares of peatlands, forests, rivers that are led all by the communities themselves. You have to recall that in Finland, there are no land rights. This is a deviation from what I have listened carefully from Janine, when the tribal rights in the US or Canada enable you to be a party on the table. But there are huge parts of the world where indigenous or traditional communities don't have a say. And this is the case in Finland on land rights, whether it's the Sami or our Finnish traditional villages. And to make the point for our tremendously important panel here and the event, restoration and rewilding can be used as a vehicle, if I can summarize, to realize those rights in practice. First of all, it shows that these villages are not victims if they can do something about degraded lands and nurturing them back into health. We have seen on my village, peatland, a return of over 195 bird species, both in quantity and quality, rare waders, derek sandpiper, and the lot, which gives a lot of hope, self-esteem to these highly damaged and marginalized communities. It brings jobs. Biosticks has created in Australia ranger programs. We are putting in place guardianships by the ladies so that women will have safe jobs in the communities. We are conducting surveys using indigenous and traditional knowledge, and so on, which are, again, in economically marginalized communities, tremendously important. But the most important lesson here is that it gives back the agency. It says you can actually physically change the reality of a degraded landscape back into a better. It's not the primary nature, but it's a tremendous shift from what used to be. So what we are essentially undoing a century of damages and think that we can survive this century by healing the land, and to the extent we can, we also realize that indigenous knowledge and science have to work together, because we can't deduct things like radioactivity or acidity. The last thing to say is that this realizes also communal rights. And that's why we have registered a lot of our sites, a lot of our rewilding areas under the UN as ICCAs, indigenous and community conserved areas, which gives them protection and well-being and safety. Thank you.
Tara, thank you. And we're going to go to questions in just a moment here. But Janine, I want to come back to you briefly. How do we give agency in places like the United States? How do we get these voices that are marginalized to become part of the solution? How do we bring that back in more?
We need true cross-sectional advocacy, political advocacy, as well as economic advocacy, because money speaks, especially in the US. Every time we try to develop solutions for large-scale restoration, the question always comes down to who's going to pay for it. Like, where is this money going to come from? And we are all tax-paying people, whether we live on reservations or not. And I think that when we really deepen our political analysis and the way that we build our movements around these issues, and then we center the voices of our most vulnerable, marginalized peoples and the peoples who have been championing these solutions for generations, we can really get somewhere by pushing for radical and effective changes in our political systems.
Wish we had more time to talk about this. This is, to me, the most significant element of restoration. If individuals aren't involved, if they aren't a part of this, if they aren't given agency, then I think restoration is much harder to achieve. So I'm grateful that you're both with us. We're going to go to questions here in just a second. I'm going to bring in some other folks that are with us. Judy Schwartz is coming back in. Jane Madgwick is also here still with us. Natalie, I'm bringing you up in case you are able to join us as well. But I want to throw in, and I'll ask Judy about this first, but I want to ask about the idea of hope and how people can get involved. So where is the hope here, and where are the engagement, the access points for people to become a part of restoration efforts in their communities?
Well, the hope is when we see what can be done. I mean, hearing about what Tiro just said about the bird species that have returned. So the hope comes from seeing what's possible in urban environments, all the examples that everyone has given. And also, I guess the core here is that the UN decade is an invitation. It is an invitation to everybody, wherever you are. And everybody has something to offer, whether it's that you're on land and you have the knowledge about how to work with land, whether you are a community organizer and are helping people to rally to understand what opportunities they have to restore the ecosystems on which they live and with which they interact. Tira also used the word agency, which is so important. And this is where I see the decade as so transformative, is that instead of relying on the experts, so often the way that environmental challenges are presented is inherently disempowering in that, okay, the experts will take care of it, and the rest of you people, well, you can give some money to this cause or whatever. But here we want to give agency to everybody. It's an invitation to people wherever you are, whether you are nearby forests, whether you live on grasslands, whether you work in agriculture, whether you live in cities or on the edge of cities. The hope comes in including everybody.
Jane, how about you? Where do you see hope in this effort?
Yeah, we see that returning hope in a landscape is absolutely crucial, and this is all about engaging the people who live in the landscape. I mean, we've seen people who are really living on the edge of northern Java, for example, where the waves are coming in and flooding their houses because the mangrove buffer was lost, and they lost hope. I would say you need a combination of kind of the best science that helps you understand what's happening with the engagement and bringing back not just agency, but authority of the local people to make the changes. If you can get that combination right, then yes, technical solutions are part of it, but it's a small part. And it doesn't work unless it's embedded in this engagement, in this social process, and unless you put the power in the hands of those local people to follow through. Because in the end, it's not going to last unless what's done is benefiting them and their livelihoods and economy, unless they believe in it. So it's the reconnecting the spirit of the local community with nature, enabling them to see how valuable a return of nature can be to them, and how that is part of their society and economy. That's what we have to do, and we're not really trained in that as ecologists, but we learn that it's necessary.
Well, it's interesting because much of this has come about because of our disconnection with the natural world. And what you were both saying is that we need to reconnect people with that. And in so doing, the value of restoration will be more clear. Is that accurate, Jane, from what you're saying?
Definitely. And I've seen it too many times in conferences. Okay, nature-based solutions. Yes, we have the technology. There's finance here, government to government mechanism, let's do it sort of thing. But we know that is just not going to work. You cannot plug it in. So, I think there is a problem in how, large scale restoration is conceived, unless there's some also investment in organizations who are based locally, who are embedded in the community, who can connect with government at different scales, who can broker this understanding between the private sector, government, and civil society, who are there for the long term. Unless they are enabled to play this convening role, it's not going to be taken up. And I don't know why there's such a blindness about this.
Well, it's fascinating because it started probably in the 70s, where we really pushed for massive technological solutions to these massive problems. But by creating these technological solutions, it removed people, it removed communities from that process. And I think that several generations now have sort of lost that connection. It's more complex than that, but this we're talking about finding massive technological solutions again, and still not connecting people to that.
Yeah, and it gets down to professional training. For example, we've been involved in helping to change the way that water engineers come into the profession, so that they, nature-based solutions, building with nature is part of their curriculum, and that this social element is brought in. And I think a lot can be done quite quickly, actually, to connect different professional training approaches, to just change the mindset, basically.
So, Natalie, I want to come to you in just a second, but Janine, I need to ask you this. The idea of hope. I mean, restoration means justice for so many people who are living in these degraded landscapes. So where does hope lie for you?
Hope lies for me in a different place. It lies in what my people and Indigenous peoples all over the globe have been able to preserve despite so many others losing their way. We didn't all lose this connection. We've been fighting for and protecting it and maintaining it despite all of the gross, overwhelming acts of genocide and forced assimilation that has happened over generations. I mean, just this week, 215 children, some as young as 3 years old, were found in a mass grave outside a residential school in Canada. That means 860 grandparents had their grandchildren taken away, and the linkage for intergenerational knowledge broken at that point. And there's hundreds more of these graves, maybe even thousands, across Canada and the United States. And despite despite that legacy and that history of boarding schools, our peoples have still been on the forefront of these conversations, even if they haven't been given decision-making authority and leadership. That resiliency and that love and that commitment to restoring balance in our world and in our ecosystems through a way that centers a earth-based wisdom, an earth-based consciousness that recognizes the sacredness of all forms of life, the preciousness of all forms of our life-giving elements. To me, like, that's where my hope lies, and that's where science needs to be informed by those perspectives and those worldviews and the languages that can help expand our collective consciousness.
Natalie, I saw some thumbs up from you on that. Anything to add? Natalie, can you hear me? Is my microphone gone? Hello, can anyone hear me? Let me get back here. Okay, you can hear me. So Natalie is the only one. Okay, all right. So then let's Tara, let's come to you and also talk about your level of hope.
Well, there's not much we can add to Janine's viewpoint on the tremendous power. Let's stop there for a second. Tremendous power that is centered and is almost unlimited in traditional engagements with the landscapes that have been preserved. Not many people understand that. They think of the folklore, they think of anecdotal evidence. What they don't realize is that human bodies can, in some cases, be engaged with their seen and the unseen in their home areas in most profound ways. And the most central message of hope in that is that we belong. We are not wrong. None of us are wrong. Like Natalia was talking about the cities and the urban scapes, we do belong. We are not wrong. And that's the first step we need to do anywhere, to say that we are not the enemy of nature. And from there, my hope lies in, and I get to meet with the global leaders, I get to meet the community rangers and the women, and the most profound realization personally is that the future is not set. There are still things to be done today, tomorrow, in a year, and in a decade. The future is not set, despite the narratives that are given to us by the Hollywood, by strong media, by all these things. And it's not fake news narrative. It's a realization. It's a profound awakening that we have such a meeting, for example, today with all of these people. It's not a trifle thing. Why don't we change it today? If not now, when? And we have all these things on our disposal. We have leaders like Janine and many other elders and women in the indigenous world. We have the most brilliant scientists who are listening, and even some political figures and spiritual leaders that are willing now to make the final push, and we will. So that's what's giving me hope, that despite the dark hour, we are at the cusps of a major breakthrough.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Natalie, can you hear us again?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, now I can. Great. So I have a question on the screen that I'd like to get to if I could. How do we bring these ideas of ecological restoration to scale and make them as well known as climate disaster? How do we scale these in a way that also brings public awareness and attention to their efforts? Natalie? Oh, she's frozen on us. Oh, I'm so sorry. Up your back. Okay.
Oh, okay. So yeah, now I'm having to shift gears because I was preparing my thinking on the other question. First, big shout out to Janine. I really thank you so much for your words and bravery for standing up for a lot of injustices happening, not only in the U.S. with indigenous populations, but around the world. Massacres, indigenous genocides, dispossession of land happening everywhere. So thank you so much for talking about that. I think how we bring these ideas to scale, well, I'm here actually in Uganda with Warren Brush, and we're about to do another training on what we're calling sponge farm design, from floods to food. And I think about Judith and John D. Liu, the importance of storytelling, capturing, documenting all of these successes, and pollinating. We're all pollinating each other right now with knowledge and inspiration. I think there's
This is a difficulty.
problems.
So sorry for the problems of access.
We just
Natalie? Okay, I'm sorry. We'll have to just bring up some important points, but Natalie, you've disappeared on us.
Can you hear me?
You're coming in and out.
Okay.
All right, so let's say I want to bring up a question that someone else from the audience has put up as well. And that's the idea about cultural buy-in and the idea of the arts. In fact, they had another comment here as well. Incredibly important. I'm not hearing much about the role of art in systems change. I think this is a really interesting aspect of it. So bringing other elements into this. Janine, I think I saw you interested in this.
No, absolutely. I think that that's where and how Indigenous peoples have been able to preserve so much over time is by carrying on and continuing our art and other cultural practices that, you know, we don't call it art, right? Like they're part of our life ways. They're part of creating things that are very important for our peoples, for ceremonies, for transference of knowledge and teaching skills to youth. But, you know, like you brought up the aspect of basket making. We also have weaving in Dene culture. And so part of our cultural resurgence has been led by young people who've carried on those practices and went even further to try to dig back deeper into what did weaving look like pre-colonial contact. And in that process, learning the names of native plants and fauna that were used to create threads when we weren't dependent on wool and a wool economy. And like in that process now asking important questions and learning with other plant experts in our communities about where are these plants located, why are they being removed, learning about the impacts of invasive species as well as desertification in our communities, and now being committed to a process of restoration in order to bring that life back to our lands, and so that we can continue those practices. And that's why our languages and what you know, even our oral histories are so important, because in the absence of climate data, both because of lack of interest, but also because of racism and how science is carried out in our communities, our oral histories and the knowledge that has been passed down through generations serve as our climate record of how landscapes and how medicines, how wild foods, how our dependency and our stewardship practices on these landscapes have changed over time and what those impacts have been. And so a lot of the resurgence of our cultural revitalization have been led by young people using all types of art forms and media in order to share this information, harnessing both content creation on social media platforms, creating their own videos to tell our own stories, to document our own narratives and create that record of what's going on the ground. And then, you know, like just transforming the fashion industry by bringing in new types of eco-smart textiles and designs and to help challenge the ways that we look at our dependency on all forms of precious life in our ecosystems and our responsibility to maintaining the health and functions of those ecosystems.
Others want to respond to the idea of art?
And maybe just to mention, since the questioner mentioned wetlands, that the Ramsar Convention of Wetlands, of which there's, I think, 160 countries signed up now. It actually recognises the cultural value of wetlands as a core value, alongside all of the others, and has done a tremendous job actually just gathering the evidence base for that and sharing it. I think this is really important. Art is a massive vehicle for connecting or strengthening the connection between people's spirit and the nature around them. So yes, let's bring this definitely into the whole business, if you like, of restoring landscapes and bringing ecosystems back.
So we've got about 10 minutes left, so we're going to start winding things up. But I realized that I asked most of you about where you find hope. And I realized in that discussion that it offered some hope for me. And Tara, I want to ask you about this in particular. I've spent a lot of time working in Africa, in South Sudan, Malawi, Zambia, South Africa. And while in several of those countries, we worked with farmers, with journalists actually, to teach them permaculture techniques that they could pass on to their communities. And we did this because in a continent that gave us so much of our agricultural systems early on, much of that indigenous knowledge has been wiped out. It's been lost. So we were showing them techniques that perhaps had started in those communities thousands and thousands of years ago. So I've had this belief or understanding that much of indigenous connection to the land in many communities has been lost. And my hope is coming from hearing all of you talking about how that's not the case, that my perceptions and my biases are inaccurate. Taro, does that seem correct? Janine, you've talked about that. Taro, in the communities you've worked in as well, is that accurate? That knowledge is there, that awareness is there, and we need to bring that out, make it more present, and make it more part of this process?
Well, thank you, Dale. And I guess there are two short points to that question. One of the things is that back in the day, there was an image that was created, the noble savage on the way out to extinction. And then you create media stories, you create films, you create the big, powerful discourse in society that indigenous ways of life or traditional ways of life are incompatible and they'll be lost in any case, which led to all kinds of things like the salvage anthropology and removal of sacred objects from many communities because everybody thought the die-off moment will be just here. Of course, the truth is that, much like we heard from others, is that despite everything, traditional and indigenous communities have somehow held on, or they have been holding on to that core. And needless to say, the damages are vast. The good news is that what we have found over 20 years is no change, is that all the knowledges are out there on the land. If you have people that are rediscovering, whether you're young or elder or a woman or man, if you actually stay on those traditional and community lands, there's immense things that come back. Now, some aspects of that knowledge will be sacred or only for that family, individual, or community, so I'm not going to go into details of how profound things can happen. The most important thing to say here in my mind is that that land is a sentient being. It's a non-human living being. And that's a very profound statement to make in public, but I'll just make it out here. And that's what you will find all across the globe. And in that way, the land is then giving you lots of those knowledges back if you're there with her. And that's why nothing is lost. In fact, we could rebuild everything if we have the people on the land. Of course, the fact that churches, state, military, and now global economy has wiped out so much of the capacity to transfer knowledges, the rebuilding will take more time. But I'm actually not worried too much about that. And this is not an abstract statement. It's a very practical one. I went to other university with old fishermen on the ice, and I hand learned over 15 years ways of fishing that are thousands of years old, which I knew nothing of when I was a child. And that comes not only as a practice, but it comes with the whole mindset, worldview, and feeling of interconnectedness. And therein lies the capacity to rebuild. But it can be sped up by language nests, recognizing rights, supporting indigenous institutions, and all these other things. And I think, to summarize, to a very good question, we are living in a world of illusions created by the big society of that noble savage and dying out events. In fact, this is a living planet with thriving cultures, and there's so much we could do, like the fire sticks example from Australia demonstrates on returning to indigenous management of fire, which is a good fire and prevents things like the horrible fires out of control in Australia last year.
Wow, some very powerful comments. And I made the mistake of leading with the idea of hope, and I should have left that for the last question. But I think this has been, to me, one of the most important aspects of this conversation. So thank you. So we've got just a couple of minutes. I'm going to ask each of you for a very quick final thoughts on restoration over the next 10 years. And writ large, however you view that, however you think about it, what you'd like to leave all the people watching this with. So I'll start with Natalie and see if she can join us while she's unfrozen. Natalie? I'm so sorry. So let's, why don't we start with Jane then? Oh, Natalie, you're back. So I don't know if you heard the question, but can you talk to us about your last thoughts on the next 10 years of restoration? There's my answer. Jane, how about we come over to you?
Okay, that's a tough one. 10 years, yes, this is the 10 years. We have to make it happen, right? It's really urgent that we make big progress. It is possible to do, but it's only possible with, real transformation, as we've discussed, and also if it's really coming from the heart, not just from the science. I think, my feeling about ecosystem restoration, is the decade on ecosystem restoration, is we've just got to get this out of the box of it being a concern of environmentalists only. It's not. It's got to become everybody's business. So somehow, if we can break down this box and make it everybody's business, then we will succeed. And I'm hopeful.
Natalie, you've come back in, so I don't know if you heard the question, but your thoughts on the next 10 years of restoration. I'm sorry, it's such a struggle, Natalie. Let's give her a quick second to see if she comes back in and reconnects. And that's not going to happen. All right, Tero, if we could come to you, please.
Well,
Natalie's back. While she's there, can you answer the question real quick before you disappear? I'm sorry, Natalie. It's not working. Oh, I'm so sorry, but thank you for joining us. Tero, why don't we come back to you, please?
All right, I'll be very quick. Restore what's still, maintain what's still there. So all those biodiverse spots, safeguard them and recognize the rights for those custodian communities that are still there, and rewild and restore where we can. So nature has tremendous capacity to come back. It won't be the primary post-ice age landscape, but it will be something highly significant, and therein we can do so much. I, of course, speak on the behalf of the northern peoples and Arctic here, and the Arctic will be at the crux, at a juxtaposition for a lot of these. How do we drill the oil? How do we use the land? And whether we tap into the wealth of the North or not. And I hope we don't. Rather, we rebuild and let the planet heal itself.
Thank you. Janine?
Building off of what Tara said, and also the excellent comments being made by Natalie and in the chat, for the audience, want to name that she's saying we're living on a living planet. She's our university. Haven't talked about seed security. It's a very huge issue. And all sectors, all industries, if it's good for the planet, there's regenerative enterprise to be engaged in. We have to change the perception of growth economic models. So building off of all of that, for the next 10 years, we need to radically and effectively resource our young generation of leaders who are trying to champion a different way, who are advocating for decentralized solutions, who are advocating for rights-based intersectional solutions, who do understand the climate crises and what we're facing because they're the ones inheriting the planet, and who have, we need to resource their vision so that we can invest in a new manifestation of a brighter, more sustainable, more regenerative future for their children and their grandchildren. And I think that if we can focus on that in the next 10 years and build the next generation of climate conscious leaders, not just climate leaders, but wherever industry, whatever work they do, whatever sector they're in, if they're climate conscious leaders that understand that, like Tara said, the earth is a living, sentient, beautiful being that we are connected to, I think we're going to be okay.
Janine, thank you. I think that's something we should talk about for a future program. I think that would be very powerful to have many of these leaders together and talk about that. So thank you for that. Also, you talked about economics. It's an opportunity to give a shout out to Kate Rayworth and her book, Donut Economics, and the value that she's brought to that discussion about changing economics and how to make it more responsive to both social and ecological elements of the earth. Judy, last word.
Yeah, so we're flirting with it right now that we're talking about a transformation, and that's where we are. We're like at the edge of it. And what I want to say here is that in looking towards healing our landscapes and seascapes, we have an opportunity to heal ourselves. And I mean heal on an individual level, on a community level, on a societal level. And so to understand that, yes, we are of this living earth. And as we move forward with that understanding, the potential for healing and flourishing and justice is right before us.
Wonderful. A great way to end things. Thank you, everybody. Unfortunately, we run out of time, but I'm grateful for all of you for joining us. Before everybody leaves, some additional information. We will have a blog post that will contain more information and resources on this topic for all of you listening. You can look for that place probably at the end of next week at this website. The address is blogs, blogs.ei.columbia.edu. That's the State of the Planet blog at the Earth Institute. Also, check out Andy Revkin's initiative on communication and sustainability at the Earth Institute. That's where my program lives, and you can read more about us there. Thank you all for joining us and for this fantastic conversation. I hope everyone listening has a wonderful, blessed weekend, and great to see you all. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye for now.